Well, welcome to the podcast. My guest today is Shawn Gabie. He is the founder of Kingdom Culture and lead pastors with his wife, Michelle. Shawn is the author of The Secrets of the Supernatural Life. He is also the founder of the Supernatural Leadership School and has a podcast called the Supernatural Leadership Podcast. Shawn has traveled extensively around the world, has been involved in training and coaching of both young and old in supernatural life, crossing denominational lines, as well as in the marketplace with business leaders and influencers. Shawn and Michelle have 4 beautiful kids: Promise, Victory, Ezekiel, and Harvest. Shawn, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
Thank you so much, Tim, for having me. It's been great just to get to know you a little bit, and I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I love your kids' names, by the way. I have to say that off the bat. And those are
Oh,
awesome.
thank you so much. They all have a meaning. Names are
Yeah.
very important to us, and they all had a specific meaning and a specific season that kind of marked the season. They really represent their names if you got to know them.
That's great. Awesome. Love that. So tell us a little more about you. You have a long bio, and there's a lot of stuff in there we could pick apart, but just from a general perspective, help our audience understand a little more about you.
Yeah. So, I mean, when I was 18, I had an encounter with Jesus. He was made real to me in my car on a major highway in my city in Ottawa, Canada, capital of the beautiful country of Canada. And I didn't believe that Jesus was real up until this point. My lifestyle did not represent it, although I had been exposed to church culture. I really did not have an understanding of the reality of Jesus. And when I was 18, in a very, very, very low place on the highway, no one was with me in the car. I had what I would have called, what I got language later on for this, but a visitation from God Himself in my car. And I remember this being so. The only way that I could explain it to people was to reference drugs, because that was my that was the way I could illustrate what this encounter felt like. And I remember being in my car. It was like a 1990 I think it was 1992 Topaz, and it was like tangible. This is how I describe it: tangible peace filled my car. I could feel it on my body. I didn't see anything. And when I felt this, and like my car filled with, at the time, I didn't really fully understand it was the presence of God, but it was like I was having this encounter. I heard a voice speak to me saying, "Make a choice." And it was like when you're having a dream, you just know things, you don't know how you know things. It was like the internal spiritual blinders lifted off my eyes, and I knew that this was Jesus revealing Himself to me. And so I said out loud, "I don't know what this means, but I'm all in. Like, I'll give you whatever. Like, I'll give you my life." And lost my job 3 weeks later. I spent the next 6 months, 4 to 8 hours a day, getting to know Jesus in relationship. But I remember saying this almost every day to God. If I could have that encounter with you in my car on the highway, no one was praying for me, no one was talking to me, then I can have this kind of encounter with you every single day. So I would study the word for 4 to 5, 6, 7, 8 hours. Sometimes I would go to the street, share my story, share what was happening to me. I would pray, seek God. I mean, all day long, 4 to 8 hours a day for 6 months, couldn't get a job. And in that time, it was like God built a foundation that I am still living on today. And it changed the game for me. I mean, some of the things I saw in that season in the club and the bar really altered my faith forever. And that became sort of a stepping stone into my journey. I mean, we can go, there's so many other details, but that's just the basis Cole's Notes version of what happened to me.
That's so powerful. Can't deny an experience like that. And that was something where you knew about Jesus, I think, growing up, didn't you? But it was different when you actually experienced Him. Can you explain a little bit about what that was like? Just the tangible, the cognitive knowing about, this person named Jesus, but then when he actually became real to you, what was that difference?
Yeah, I would say like the big difference was I believed that there was a God, but I did not have an understanding of Jesus as God. I believed there was something out there. I believed there was something divine. But to be honest with you, my church exposure for the most part was more of a religious practice exposure than it was like, wow, I'm seeing like the manifestation and evidence that God is really real.
Mm.
And so, yeah, I had like sort of a theory that there was a God. And I'd always kind of been interested in supernatural things, but I would have never been able to really say that Jesus was God, that
Right.
Jesus is God at that point. And I think that's where the shift happened for me. It's like I knew there was a God, although like I was living like there was no God, and I was living like, really like in a sense like an atheist at some level.
Sure.
But there was this internal knowing that there was something more for my life. And I
Yeah.
always had, actually, I always, I was a musician, like I thought I was going to do music with my life. So I always had an internal knowing that I was going to do something different
Mm.
than just something, like typical. Like I was just going to follow everybody else's pattern, do what everybody else did out of like, high school and all this kind of stuff. And I just felt like I was going to do something different. When I had that encounter, it was like I knew this was that different thing. That I
Mm.
was going to be on a journey, a supernatural journey that was going to be wild and fun, and at the same time really freaky. Because part of my story is that when I gave my life to Jesus, I still thought I was going to do music,
Mm.
and I never thought I would be a traveling speaker, pastor, have a church, like have a school. Like I never thought that, because I grew up, my parents divorced when I was 5, and I can't prove this, but as a result of, I think, the trauma, I developed a severe speech impediment,
Mm.
and I had a severe stutter, and I went to speech therapy for it.
Wow.
So, I mean, I couldn't speak. I couldn't public speak. I mean, I would go into extreme anxiety every
Mm.
time I had an opportunity. I remember being a kid and going into extreme anxiety, just saying thank you to parents when they would like drive me home after playing with their son, because I would stutter. So I
Mm.
grew up this way. And when I was 18, had this encounter with Jesus, I'm like, there's no way in hell, literally,
Yeah.
I am ever going to speak behind a mic. I would say that to people. And 3 months later, on my baptism, I got out of the water and God loosed my tongue, and I was completely healed.
Wow.
And now that's like all I do. So
Yeah.
it's crazy, because the big part of my story is like in the weak areas of my life, that's where God has made me the strongest.
Mm. Amen. That's awesome. I love that story. And that's one of the things where the limitations that we either grew up with or that we place upon ourselves can be broken and loosed by the power of God, if it's for his purpose and timing, obviously. But at the same time, it's like we tend to put ourselves in a box of this is all I can do for God, or, but it's that
Yeah.
act of faith of stepping out and saying, if God opens that door for you to do it in faith and see where he leads you, because it's not going to be in your power, it's going to be through his power. And I think that's a good testimony for all of us to remember. And the things that we say, I can't do that. It's like, well, what is God calling you to do? That's the first step. In order to keep our eyes on Jesus, we have to be following him and obeying him. And from that, we see the blessing of that, living that life of obedience. And so that propelled you into trajectory of being a pastor, a coach, and doing all this awesome stuff. Like, what was that like after your baptism? When did you feel that call to actually start to go out and to lead?
I actually, to be honest with you, never wanted to be in what we call, like, I mean, everybody's in ministry, whatever sphere they're in, they're
Yeah.
ministering, they're called to some form of ministry. I never actually wanted to be in what was called vocational. I actually had no language for that. I didn't know that culture, being where I was, Ottawa, Canada, that wasn't part of my lingo. Like I
Mm.
just didn't have any concept for what an itinerant speaker was, or ministry. In fact, most of my perspective was really warped by some of my experience and what I saw. And so I kind of, honestly, my story is very different. I kind of fell into stuff where I just was faithful. This is kind of the message of my life,
Mm.
stewarding what God was doing in my life. I'd go to the street, I'd share my story, go to the bar, go to the club, share my story. Like I was always sharing. Actually, there was a time where I felt like if people weren't sharing and weren't doing what I was doing, I'm like, you must not even be a believer. Like that's how raw I was in the beginning.
Yeah.
And I really questioned everything. I'm like, why are people not doing this? I'd be praying for the sick. I would like be seeing it in the Bible. I'm like, people were getting healed in the Bible. Why aren't they getting healed? So I'd go out, pray for
Mm.
people, and stuff would begin to happen. And I was just doing that all the time. I was so hungry for God. This 4 to 8 hour a day for 6 month season set a precedent for me.
Mm.
And then all of a sudden it was like, you know how things happen. It's like opportunities just begin to happen. Doors
Yeah.
begin to open. And, I was still doing music a lot actually at the time. What changed, I would say this, what changed is when I met this couple who basically from the US who I had heard that, were leading teams down in New Orleans, down at Mardi Gras every year. They'd come to this event that I was playing drums at, actually. I was actually playing drums at it. And they asked me to come, move to Minnesota and travel with them for the next, basically year and a half as they would mentor me. Now, that was my introduction, to be honest with you, to some sort of itinerant type ministry, because I didn't start out as, like I said, wanting to do any of this stuff. I started out as an itinerant ministry. After this point, the pastor thing came later. I never thought I would pastor a church. That was not, once again, in the cards.
Yeah.
It all just kind of happened organically. And I think for some people, that is the best way for things to happen. When we force doors open, if we force doors open, we can also close those doors on ourselves.
Right.
If other people force those doors open for us, those people can also, or other people can close the doors. But when God opens a door,
that's right,
no man can close the door. And so this was my prayer. God, if this is right, if this is you, then you got to make it happen.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to do anything that's not in my grace capacity. A lot of people go to Bible school and go because they have this ideal of ministry and platform. They get there, they're like, I don't have the grace for this. I had this idea that it was awesome, but I don't have the grace for this. And honestly, so if you don't have thick skin, if you don't have perseverance, some of this stuff is just not for you. Everybody has to find their lane, has to find their space and occupy it well. And so for me, like I said, I fell into a lot of this, and God has just really blessed the journey and favored the journey.
Yeah, that's great. I love that idea of capacity, because we all have a capacity and it can be grown and stretched and increased. But at the same time, where you're at in the moment, we often look at other people and their journey and compare ourselves with them and want what they have and want the platform without the process to get there, which includes heartache and hardship and training and growth and the hard things that we need to get to that place of position that God wants us to be in. And sometimes we are not in a position of authority or leadership necessarily in what we see in our own eyes, but that doesn't mean we don't have influence with our sphere of that God has put us in, whether you're a stay-at-home mom or whether you're in the marketplace or whether you're serving at your local church, giving coffee to people with a smile, all those things have a purpose and a plan at the moment that you're in them. And God may not keep you there forever, but can you find joy where you're at? Can you find purpose where you're at? Not just wanting the next big thing, because sometimes that next big thing won't come unless you're content and obedient with where God has placed you in the moment. And that's kind of the focus for this season of the podcast is when we make a decision and when we have discernment and leads us down a path of blessing, when we follow God, there's also roadblocks that come up in our life too, where we have to persevere and push through things. Even if God's leading us down something, I never want it to seem like just because you make the right decision, there won't be a season that you have to persevere and push through. And so if you could share with us maybe a time in your life when you had a roadblock, you thought you were on the right path, God was leading you down, but then you're like, why is this happening? And you had to persevere and push through to see the blessing on the other side.
Yeah, I've thought about this for a little bit. There's so many times. It's really hard to pinpoint one. I mean, I have so many personal moments. I have ministry moments. I think even just if I was to say the last 7 years has been a persevering moment in that, not only coming through a pandemic, where my province, Ontario, has had some of the strictest rules and some of the craziest restrictions than any place in the world at some level. I mean, for 2 years, I mean, we for example, as a church culture, we didn't meet physically for 23 months. Lots of variables in that, but in 2015 of the fall, we had this permanent meeting space. It was great, big commercial space, and we lost it to bigwig Costco came in, bought the whole complex, and we had 2 months to get out. And we went from being an established community in our own space to becoming a mobile church. That was a very big shift because, I went into, this pastoring dynamic, leading a church on top of the itinerant stuff, really believing it was the right thing. And like you said, just because it's the right thing doesn't mean you're not going to have tests. In fact, because it's the right thing means you're going to have the greatest of tests, because you are always going to be tested to see if you actually believe that God actually had brought you to this space and to this place.
That's right.
It's like, Joseph, it says in Psalms that until the time came for his dreams to come to pass, the Lord tested his character. So we have these dreams, we have these things that we know are God, but then there's a process between, the promises being fulfilled and the promise being given. And in that process, we're constantly being tested to prove our character, that we're even like, I don't want to say the word worthy, but in a sense, like capable of holding up and handling like the promise, the ultimate goal that God is leading us towards. And so, we lost our building and we're now at our 14th venue in 7 years, but 13 of those venues was in the first like 3 years. And so I would say every single season of changing venues, constantly venue to venue, losing like 3/4 of our church culture because we were moving so much. We became like Israel in the wilderness, setting up a tent, moving around, people dying off like it was in the wilderness, sort of metaphorically speaking. And, all of that season was the craziest of perseverance. I wanted to quit so many times. Like I wanted to give up. I'm like, what the heck is going on? Like, this is crazy. Like, is this right? Did we miss something? Like, not that we didn't try to buy buildings. We had like offers on buildings. We had buildings we were trying to buy. Nothing worked out. So we stayed mobile. And then pandemic hits. It's like, the world has to go into a whole pivot. I mean, for us, we stayed in that pivot more than the US, more than our friends down under. You guys like were living in the land of the free. When I say free in the sense of like, it was just more complicated because we didn't have a venue, and all these venues that we were using had all these restrictions. So we couldn't meet. And so we were online for 23 months. In fact, we just came back live just 5 weeks ago. And now we're at a new venue. So I think I would say, like, without pinpointing one story, which I would say like we go through seasons where we have to persevere for a very long time. And then it's like, then there's seasons of rest. I'm praying like, hey, this is the 7th year. So maybe, this is going to this is going to be like the Sabbath year. We get our place and we're like established again and building. Right. So perseverance. I mean, I think I was saying yesterday to our community, actually, I said, I would rather be known for my perseverance than my spiritual gifts.
That's good.
Because in the end, if I don't have perseverance, my spiritual gifts don't have impact.
Right.
I want to be long lasting.
Yeah, exactly. Because people will see you quitting or giving up or being downtrodden. And then that's not an example to other people that are going through similar stuff themselves, as you're wanting to quit. And we all get to that point where like, maybe God's not in this. Maybe I just need to quit and take the easy road. But that's a good story, because if you guys got the building before COVID, then you'd have to pay rent on that and not be able to meet in it, and God was preparing you for a season when you pivoted and had to move. And it's such a good example of the pillar of fire and the cloud that Israelites were led by. Whenever the cloud moved, they had to move because they wanted the presence of God. They wanted to not do it on their own. At least Moses knew enough to move when God moved. But they got comfortable, they camped, they got to a place, and they never knew when that was coming. They never got a month's heads up. It just, okay, we're all camped, we're all comfortable. Now the fire is moving. We need to go, So that's such a good example in our life too, is like, we get comfortable, we get in a season, we're like, all right, this is it. This is what I've been working towards. I can just hang out here for 10 years, and God's like, well, I got other plans. And so we have to be obedient to where God is moving, because if we try to do it on our own and not follow God, then we get into problems with that too. So we have to move where God is. And just because God is there doesn't mean it's going to be easy or lack of resistance. Like you said, actually the opposite, there will be resistance, because the enemy does not want us to move in the plans that God has for us. So,
I believe this, if I can just add to that, is I believe a closed door on the outside really is an invitation to an open door on the inside, because when God closes a door, it opens something in us that we have to begin to trust deeper. It's like when Paul said, while he was in prison, writing to the first century Christians at Philippi in Philippians chapter 4, I believe it's 13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. He's writing this to encourage the Philippian believers while he's in prison, while he's the one needing encouragement. He's declaring over himself, I can do all things. And that phrase, I can do, means to get into the fray or to engage the resistance.
Yeah.
And I think that this is like this is why a lot of MMA fighters have that tattooed on their body. It's like when you're called to fight through and persevere tough moments, you need to have an understanding that in the end, the only way you're going to be able to win through this resistance is through Christ, who gives us strength to win through it.
Yeah.
And so when a closed door happens on the outside, it tests our ability to engage that resistance when we're like, what do we do now? Like, where do we go now? Like, are we going to quit? Did God call me to this, or did man call me to this? Because if man called me to this, yeah, I could quit.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to quit if God called me to it, because
That's
even
right.
if no one shows up or no one's there, like, God, are you still in this? Like, if you're
Right.
in this, I'm all in.
That's so crucial. That's the key right there. If God's in it, I want to be a part of it, whether it looks like I think it should look in my own expectations. That's what I have to get over, because just like, the verse, I can do all things, the verse before that's talking about contentment.
Yeah.
Paul's talking about contentment. And then he says, I can do all things through Christ, which means I can have that contentment in all things as he's in prison, as Joseph was in prison. We read through those verses and just say, yeah, Joseph was in prison for however many years. Like, well, what happened to Joseph's mindset in day 1, in day 20, in day 200, when he's in prison? We read the Bible and just like this, yeah, and then this happened and 40 years went by. But these are real people that have real emotions, real fears, real, dreams that were shattered. And yet they still persevered. Joseph persevered, and he was the savior of Israel in famine because he was faithful in the time when he was in prison, when he was accused of something he didn't do. He still was faithful to God, who then upheld him, and that will preach in itself. So
Totally.
I love that. And I want to move on, because you talk a lot about supernatural. Your podcast and your school is Supernatural Leadership. And I want to talk just this concept of supernatural and how that's been important in your life, both practically and how we connect with God and what God is doing through us, and how we have to keep our eyes on Jesus, who is a supernatural God. But just from a practical perspective in our life, how should we be aware of what is going on in the supernatural?
Yeah, at the very onset of my journey, and I kind of shared a little bit about that, I feel like my journey started very supernatural.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, my prayer every day for the first 6 months was like, if I can have that type of engagement with you that feels like real relationship in my car on a highway,
Yeah.
I can have that with you, God, every day in my bedroom, every day in my house, every day when I go out to do my business, my career, whatever that looks like, go to the grocery store, gas station. And so I made it my objective to demonstrate kind of what Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, where he said, like, listen, like the kingdom of God is not a matter of just chatter talk.
Mm-hmm.
It's a matter of power. It's about power, so that your faith may not rest on man's wisdom, but on God's power.
Mm.
So I just didn't want to know a lot. I wanted to experience a lot, so that I can help other people experience the reality of Jesus that I was experiencing.
Mm.
And so I made it my objective to really just do the gospel. And honestly, at the beginning, I didn't have the typical, evangelism 101 Romans road memorized. I didn't have tracks. I didn't have all this stuff that people do.
Mm-hmm.
Not knocking it, but I didn't have that. All I had was a story
Mm-hmm.
of moving from like darkness to light.
Yeah.
Jesus was real for me, and I was hungry to see him be real for others.
Mm.
And that at the beginning set a tone, like I've mentioned. And I feel like from the very beginning, I wanted to really be someone that recognized the voice of God. And so this led me through a series of events over the next several years, developing my first course on the supernatural. It was actually, back then, it was called School of the Prophetic 101. And it was about the kingdom. It was about recognizing the voice of God. It was about how to activate faith in your everyday life. And we would take people through a 6-week course. And a lot in the beginning, these people that were in my first ever school was in a house with 13 people. I think I was at the time I was 21.
Mm-hmm.
And these people that were in this school with me, 13 people, most of them had been saved longer than I'd been alive.
Wow.
And they had heard my stories. So they were just like, I want to learn. These guys were like from different backgrounds, Brethren backgrounds, Presbyterian backgrounds, Baptist backgrounds. I don't think I even had any like charismatics in there. It was all like, conservative type denominational people, and even some new believers. And I was just raw. This is back. I had like long dreadlocks. I had no concept of like being a professional minister. I was
Sure.
just sharing and teaching. And from there, everything exploded. And so really an MO of my life became supernatural leadership. Like
Mm.
I was inspired by the life of Daniel. Daniel was 10 times better than all the magicians and soothsayers. He was raised up, promoted. He was influential in government. He was a dream interpreter. He knew his God. He was faithful. He was consistent. And I'm like, God, I want to see Daniel's raised up.
Yeah.
Women and men. Daniel's raised up to influence culture. And so that's why our first school, really, that became an 11-year school, was School of Daniel. And all the courses that I had developed kind of fell under that. Now we've rebranded it, calling it Supernatural Leadership now. But I believe that the difference between good leadership and supernatural leadership really is about presence. What presence is driving you? Is it just the presence of principle, or is it the presence of God?
That's good.
And I think that's what defines supernatural leadership above just good leadership, is we want God's super to impact our natural, so we can emulate, like Hebrews 1, we could become representation of God, just like Jesus was representation of God, like the Father represented him fully. We want to represent Jesus in our relationship as his ambassadors. So we need a super touching our leadership, not just good principles. Jesus operated in principles, yes, but he operated in presence. John 5:19 says that Jesus said, I only do what I see my Father doing. I can do nothing on my own initiative. He set the precedent for supernatural leadership by saying, listen, I'll walk in principle, but ultimately the presence of God will direct the principles, not the other way around. And so that's why we're about that. And that's why I'm about that, is because in the very beginning of my journey, that was a huge part of the steps forward to bring me to where I am today.
I love that.
Answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that's kind of what I talk about, in my book, Everyday Discernment. Having discernment every day means that just because we make a couple big choices, maybe a year, once a year, we make a decision whether, to move a house, to get married, a new job. Like those are huge decisions. What about the thousands of decisions we make daily? How are we led to make those decisions? Are we led on our own intuition? Are we led on, what we are grounded in the word in? Are we led by the Holy Spirit? All those questions come into play when we make decisions every day. And so I think it's also applied really well to leadership, because I was in management for many years in retail, and that was very fast paced, very profit driven, very, let's get it done right now. And there was very little time to actually stop and necessarily pray. But I think there's some good analogies in what you're talking about on being driven by the presence of God. So even if you're in a busy situation, to take 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds, whatever it is, everyone has at least that kind of time. You don't have to stop and do a prayer session for 3 hours to still hear from God in the moment when you're trying to figure it out, when something didn't go right, when you're trying to put out a fire. Talk a little practically, just in those kinds of scenarios that people might find themselves in, how can they listen to God when they're just driven by get it done, get through the day, rinse and repeat the next day, come home, see my kids for 5 minutes. I don't have time to read my Bible. I'm just going to wake up, get burned out. And the weekend, I'm going to be full of activities. Like this whole busyness mentality really hampers our ability to hear from God, both in our personal life and in leadership. How would you say for someone listening that can maybe stop and hear from God who is inside them with them? But if we don't actually listen, then sometimes it's pointless.
Yeah, that's good. I would say 2 things. Well, I would just open it up with this, actually. I heard this statement years ago that's always stuck with me and impacted me. And it kind of went like this: you don't burn out by what you do, you burn out by what you stop doing. And I think that there are a lot of people that are always more busy than us.
Yeah.
And I look at some people and say, how do they do it? And one of the common, I would say, threads throughout, and just even non-believers, that's just believers in general.
Yeah.
Sometimes we blame the thing that we're doing. We're so busy, so we don't have time for XYZ. But really, we don't have time not to have time for XYZ, because if we stop doing the right things, the things that we have to do that we will claim at some point will burn us out, actually will take us out, because we actually stop supporting the thing that we're called to do by making sure we have healthy habits in place, healthy emotional habits in place, physical habits, spiritual habits. Like these are all the things that sort of undergird and support the thing that we're called to do.
Yeah.
So it's not what we do that burns us out, it's what we stop doing. And so we need to make sure we have certain healthy disciplines in our life. And so, of course, as a spiritual person who's following Jesus, we all the more. And I would say this, that the Hebrew culture didn't look at like God first, family second, career third. That's very Greek in its thinking, very linear. It's like 1+1 = 2.
Mm.
The Hebrew culture just understood it like it's just God in everything.
Mm.
Putting God first in your business, in your everyday busyness. What does that look like in your marriage? So when you're with your wife, you're putting God first because you're 100% in that space with your wife.
Yeah.
When you're with your kids, you're putting God first because you're 100%. You're not occupied with other things. When you're in your business, you're putting God first because you're focused. I think we can actually include God, kind of like Brother Lawrence did. He was a monk that practiced the presence of God. He wrote a book called Practicing the Presence of God. I'm sure you've heard of it.
Mm-hmm.
And when he was doing his chores, he was inviting God. He was 100% in what he was doing, but he was inviting God 100% in. I think
Yeah.
this is the key. We can actually, in our chaos, in our busyness, invite God. It's like Jesus in the boat. As long as Jesus is in our boat, we're safe.
Mm-hmm.
The moment Jesus is not in our boat, it's almost like as long as Jesus stays in the forefront of our focus, even when we're at our busiest, I believe it's one example of putting God first in that space. I don't believe putting God first looks like, okay, I have to spend 4 hours with God every day,
Right.
12 hours with God every day. I got to fast 3 times a week. If
Yeah.
God's giving you that blueprint and plan, sure, follow his leading. But in the end, he's not a formula.
Right.
He's not a formula
That's
that it's
good.
not instant coffee. You can just pour with hot water and it's like, boom, you've got it. Like, I believe he's in everything. He is omnipresent. Therefore, he can be in everything with us. He's everywhere and he's in everything. And so,
Yeah.
I try to make it because I don't have the same season. I have 4 kids now. I don't have the same season as I used to when I was single.
Right.
I mean, you either, right? I mean,
Yeah.
when you're single, you have a way different type of lifestyle. So for me, it's like, how do I include God in my everyday? When I'm doing this, when I'm doing that, when I'm folding laundry, when I'm doing whatever I'm doing, I have the ability to invite God in. And I think that's a key, keeping our eyes on Jesus. I don't
Yeah.
think it's as easy as saying, if you just do this, you'll win. I think it's like we want to, as long as we're pursuing balance, we are in balance. I don't
Yeah.
believe actually we'll ever find balance. I think the pendulum is always swinging to extremes.
Yeah.
And at some level, when it's swinging to extremes, we land in the middle, but it's only for a moment. We taste balance for a moment. We never live there. The moment you feel like you found balance, your car breaks down and you have no car for a week and you got to take the bus to work and everything feels out of order and out of balance. Your timelines are different now. Everything's backed up. You're behind on your schedule. Like the moment we feel like we find it, we lose it. So to me, as long as we're pursuing it, we're inviting God in. I believe that we are in a healthy place of keeping our eyes on Jesus.
Yeah, love that. That's so good. And, I think about the verse, pray without ceasing. And, we hear that and legalism sets in and we think, well, that's impossible. I cannot pray nonstop on my knees on the side of my bed. We get this picture of just nonstop praying. But what that actually means on the heart behind it is to, like you're saying, keep God with you throughout the day, meaning that you're always talking to him. You're always listening. You're always like, the kids are screaming and you take 5 seconds, say, God, help me with this. Give me your presence, Holy Spirit, right now. Give me the peace to show it to my kids, even though I want to lash out in anger. That moment that you do that will make a difference in your life when you're not just leading with your emotions or leading with your thoughts or the way you've always done it, like being led by the Spirit in those moments when things are on fire. It's not that it's just so easy, and it's so easy to follow God when things are easy, but like you're saying,
Yeah.
when are things actually easy in this world, right? We're going to have heartache, we're going to have trials, but that means we need to rely on God even more as we go through those things. And then we find his peace, then we find his direction and guidance when we don't try to do it in our own effort. And you talk about spiritual weapons that we have in leadership. What are some of these spiritual weapons that you share, and how can we apply them into our life today?
Yeah, I think one of the great, I just did an episode recently on, the weapon of leadership, and I was
Yeah.
talking about peace. It's both personal for me, and I also believe it's both scriptural that we fight with peace. John 14 talks about Jesus said, I leave peace to you, but not as the world leaves it, because the world will give it to you and it's a temporary peace. You do this, you'll feel peace for a moment. The way I give peace, Jesus said, and he didn't actually say this, but this is what he was really saying, is I give an eternal sense of peace. That if you follow me, like, you have a peace that not only when you're here, but that one day when you die, you know what's going to go down. Like, you have a peace that goes beyond your understanding, beyond your reason, beyond your logic, and it's not just temporary.
Yeah.
And then he goes on, and I believe it's verse 22, and John 14:22, I believe it is. And he goes on and he connects that peace with fear and trouble. So when you're up against fear, when you're up against trouble, great distress, great anguish, when you feel like you're being intimidated and you feel like you want to quit because it's so scary, your greatest weapon as a leader is to fight with peace. It's like when in Exodus chapter 14, when God said to Moses, like, I've led you this far, basically, and I'm going to lead you through this first big challenge at the Red Sea. God said to Moses when he got there, leading all these disgruntled people now, like a lot of people that had been, and their ancestors been in slavery for 430 years, finally get out of oppression. Now the enemy's going after them. And God says to Moses, hold your peace. Because if you lose your peace, you will lose faith in the moment to remember that I've promised I'll get you through this.
Yeah.
The moment you lose peace, I think it's what happened to the disciples in the boat in Matthew chapter 4 or Mark chapter 4. Jesus said, let's cross over to the other side. That should have alone given them an eternal sense of peace. He never said, let's go to the other side, but let's die in the middle.
Right.
Like, let's die in the middle. Let's sink. We're drowned together. Like, he didn't say. He said, let us cross over. Let's cross over to the other side.
Yeah.
And that word, literally, he said, let us cross over. That word, he said, literally means he laid the argument to rest. And it's funny because what was Jesus doing in the boat? He was resting. He was sleeping. He literally emulated his promise. And in that moment, they had the temptation of fear, distress. And Jesus is like, listen, I'm modeling for you what it looks like to have peace in the storm, because in the kingdom, in heaven, there's peace.
That's
in fact,
so good.
The kingdom, Romans 14 says, it's not a matter of eating and drinking, but of righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Spirit. So these are the building blocks of the kingdom. And so here he is modeling kingdom. Here he is asking Moses to model kingdom, and I think that for us, peace as leaders in a season where it feels so chaotic, like if we lose our peace, we lose everything. Because if we lose our peace, that's when we start making stupid decisions, destructive decisions. And so I think one of the greatest weapons of leadership is to become men and women of peace. I remember years ago, I had this encounter where God spoke to me, and I won't go into the details just for time, but where God spoke to me and said, I want you to be a man of peace. And the only way you're going to access the fullness of what I have for you while you live on this earth is becoming a man of peace. Not just, saying I have the peace of God, but actually manifesting it when you don't want to, when you're in the storm and you're in the boat, not being like the disciples, scared for their lives, thinking that Jesus had left them, even though he's still there.
Yeah.
Like really practicing peace, being a man who practices peace. And so I believe that one of the greatest weapons is peace. Especially in this season.
Yeah, I love that. And such a good example of the disciples that were looking at the storm instead of looking at Jesus. And that's such a good example for us. If we keep our eyes on social media, on the news, on wars and pestilence and all these things that we can focus on, we have a choice. We can focus on it. And if you're on social media, it comes up all the time. And if you're scrolling through and you find your peace stolen from you as you're scrolling through social media, maybe that's an idea in your head that you need to just get off social media or take a fast from it, or, unfollow certain sites. That's what I did, certain news sites that you don't need to see everything going on all the time. As long as the world's not blowing up, I wake up in the morning, oh, things are still there. I'm good. I can now focus on my Bible. Find that peace. And if it's getting stolen from you, if the enemy's stealing it from you, then take the steps to not let that happen again. And so I think that's coming out of a pandemic, as we're still in a crazy world. If we are not focused on Jesus every day, your peace will be stolen from you. But is it actually stolen, or are we just freely giving it up? Is it being stolen against our will, or are we just saying, I don't know what to do, I'm going to look for answers anywhere else but Jesus, and that gets us in trouble. And so that's a good way to end. But I also want to ask you just real quick about, as you coach people through leadership, and as we have come out of pandemic, what do you think leadership looks like in the future? How do you coach people through a season that no one prepared for, or at least no one saw coming necessarily, but we had to pivot like you pivoted in your church? Leadership has looked different now than it has in the past couple of decades. What do you think for the future of leaders, how they can stay aware of what God might be doing and also not be distracted by what the world is doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a deep question. I think that, and I was saying this yesterday to our community as well, actually, just while it's fresh in my head, I was actually saying that, I think having a proper perspective gives us what I would call peace when we're in what feels like a prison. And I think for a lot of people, I know it's not a physical one, for a lot of people, the last 2 years has felt like a prison for so many leaders. What they used to do, they no longer can do.
Yep.
Or at least they don't do as much. Maybe they've lost their job. Maybe they've changed careers. Maybe they went bankrupt because of their business was, I know for us in Canada, a lot of that happened.
Yeah.
I know that in the southern states, it's a little bit different for where you guys are at, but a lot of that happened up here. And so I think leadership looks like an ever increasing, ongoing, consistent pivot. And having the proper perspective in seasons like this is so key, because I didn't, to be honest with you, we prayed, against COVID, and we prayed that it would stop. But in the end, I didn't feel like I was supposed to spend my time praying and interceding that COVID would leave. But what I did do is I prayed that God would give me the wisdom to pivot while it was here. And I think that's the mentality of Joseph. While I'm in prison, how can I prosper? So Joseph managed the prison. Daniel was thinking probably when he was thrown in the lion's den, while I'm here. I don't even know if he was praying to get out. He just trusted God with the process. It's like Paul, the apostle, while I'm here, Ephesians, Philemon, Philippians, Colossians, 2 Timothy, while I'm here, I'm going to write some game-changing letters to encourage the believers. You don't really see Paul really praying to get out of prison.
Right.
You don't really see Paul praying to escape, because is a reality that there are some things we will never escape. I mean, one of the Beatitudes, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. You will be hated. You will be put in seasons that you don't like, that you can't just pray yourself out of.
Yeah.
And I think while you're there, okay, how do we pivot? So I think leadership looks like, since everything's gone on in the last 2 years, I think that the greatest thing that we can do moving forward is to continue to have a change mentality where we're always adapting, always innovating, always changing, and always asking God how we can pivot to continue to advance and move forward.
That's really good. And I'll just add too, as Paul and Silas were in the prison, they praised, they worshiped, they lived a lifestyle of praise regardless of the circumstance. And what a great way to end for us to remember that no matter what season you're in, no matter what, I will praise Jesus in the storm, is a good motto to live by. And from that, you find freedom, you find breakthrough that you didn't see coming. And you're not going to say, well, you're not going to, work the system. Well, if I praise, I'm going to get out of this. No, I'm going to praise despite of the circumstance, because God is God and he's still on the throne. So what a great way to end. Shawn, thank you so much for coming on. Let everyone know where they can connect with you and find your resources.
Yeah. So you can follow me on social media, for the most part, just at Shawn Gabie, and visit supernaturalleadership.com. If you want to grow more in the supernaturalleadership.com. You can as well visit ShawnGabie.com. Our local church is kingdomculture.ca. But check out supernaturalleadership.com. Subscribe to our podcast. We deliver great content each month on that podcast, just called the Supernatural Leadership Podcast. And I'd love to journey with all of you to help make your leadership a little more supernatural.
Very cool. I'll put that in the show notes. Thank you again for coming on, Shawn. God bless you and your ministry and your family.
Thank you so much, Tim. Great to see you. Great to meet you.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. For more information on Discerning Dad, go to discerning-dad.com. Be sure to follow on all the social media platforms. Just search for Discerning Dad. Please share this podcast with a friend and leave an honest review on whichever platform you listen. Feel free to send any comments, suggestions, questions, or prayer requests at discerningdad@outlook.com. Until next time, keep fighting the good fight.